Welcome to the second part of chapter 11. In the first part, we discussed conflict, different types of conflict, and what can cause conflict. We also differentiate between functional and dysfunctional conflict. One important consideration when discussing conflict is ways to resolve conflict. We want to try to resolve conflict before it becomes dysfunctional. And so we're going to look at 5 approaches to conflict resolution. Those conflict resolution approaches differ on their concern for self, assertiveness, high to low, and concern for others, cooperativeness, high to low. The competition conflict handling style, also known as the forcing conflict handling style, is a situation that involves low cooperation, low concern for others, and high assertiveness, high concern for self. In the competition conflict handling style or the forcing conflict handling style, my approach to resolving conflict will be to force my way, ensure that my goals are met without consideration for the other party's objectives. This is the forcing or competing conflict handling approach. You might ask yourself if this approach is desirable, and what are some of the downsides of taking such an approach. The competition or forcing conflict handling style is very effective in terms of efficiency. It is not very time consuming. If I enter into a conflict with another individual and I have more power, I can assert myself and I can have high concern for my needs without consideration for the other party's needs. This helps me ensure that my needs are met and that the conflict is resolved in an efficient way. This might be necessary in situations of organizational crisis, when time is of the essence, or if I have more information that the other party doesn't possess, and I know that the course of action that I am forcing, or enforcing in this case, is preferable. The problem with the competing or forcing conflict handling style is that it can create some negative emotions for the other party. It can actually be quite frustrating and leave the other party upset or disappointed that their needs were not taken into consideration at all. So while there is room for the forcing or competition conflict handling style in some situations, it's not an approach that we want to use consistently, especially if we want to have a strong, positive, long-term relationship with the other party. The opposite of the forcing conflict handling style is the accommodation conflict handling style. This approach is low on assertiveness and high on cooperativeness. High concern for others, low concern for self. In the accommodation conflict handling style, I will essentially accommodate the other party and give the other party everything that it is asking for with disregard for my own needs. This approach might be very appropriate if the issue is not at all important to me. If it is something that I'm happy to sacrifice because it's low importance, it might help me build goodwill for the future. And so the accommodation conflict handling resolution can be very effective, especially if I have the power to accommodate and I don't mind accommodating because the issue is not very important, not very essential to me. And I'm happy to make this small sacrifice to establish goodwill and reciprocity with the other party and create a situation in which they owe me one, so to speak. Of course, if I consistently use the accommodating conflict handling style, I might have or earn a reputation of being a pushover and somebody who doesn't stand up for their own needs in a conflict situation. And so while accommodating conflict handling resolution can be very effective in certain situations, it's not an approach that we want to use at all times because it might create a situation in which eventually people will start disregarding our demands or our needs when conflict arises. Right in the middle between the two is compromise. And very often we take a compromise approach to conflict resolution. This approach is about midway, both on concern for self and on concern for others, meaning we are somewhat assertive and somewhat cooperative. We don't give away everything, but we also don't take everything for ourselves. And so in such a situation, the parties might meet halfway and share a scarce resource, for example. Compromise can be very effective because, much like competition, it's very effective on time. We don't have to negotiate very much. We can decide to meet each other halfway and reach an agreement that is partially satisfactory to both parties. Every party leaves the table with something that they need, not empty-handed. And so it can create some goodwill for the future. It can create more harmonious working relationships and offer a fast and effective way to resolve conflict. Of course, compromise might lead people to start playing games. If individuals know that a compromise will usually be reached, they might ask for more than they need. And once you meet them halfway, so to speak, they will actually have their needs fully satisfied. Compromise also creates a situation in which neither party has everything that it needs. And if the conflict was over a resource that was essential for both parties to complete a task, neither party will be able to do so. So compromise is something that is part of our toolkit, but not something that we should always turn to and not always preferable to different approaches. Conflict avoidance is a situation in which both parties walk away from the conflict. And we've all been told that conflict avoidance is undesirable. Conflicts typically do not resolve themselves and tend to fester and grow and become dysfunctional if left untreated. Of course, there are some situations in which conflict avoidance might be desirable. If you do not have any power in the relationship with the other party, you might choose to avoid conflict because if you are confrontational, you might be worse off. Also, if the conflict is very emotional, very charged, and it is likely that if we try to address the conflict right now, we will say things that we regret, we might want to avoid it for the time being and address it tomorrow or in a few days when we've had some time to carefully think about it. So while conflict avoidance is appropriate in the short term, it is very rarely appropriate in the long term. This leaves one final approach to conflict resolution, which is collaboration. In collaboration, we are seeking high concern for self and high concern for others. We are seeking a win-win in which both parties receive full satisfaction of their needs and the conflict is resolved. While this approach to conflict resolution is very desirable, it is not always possible to reach, and it is very time-consuming. And in the last part of this chapter, I'll give a couple of examples of the collaborative approach to conflict resolution. The problem or the shortcoming of the collaborative approach to conflict resolution is that first, it's very time-consuming, and second, it requires that the parties trust each other sufficiently to openly share the motivations behind the demands that they're making. And when in conflict, it is not always likely that parties will be willing to do so, because openly sharing information and trusting the other party opens you up, makes you vulnerable for the other party to act opportunistically and take advantage of the trust that you have placed in them. And so the collaborative approach to conflict resolution, while it yields a win-win and a full satisfaction of both parties, it is not always easy to get to. So which style is preferred? The important takeaway from here is that there is no superior style. Each style might be suitable in certain situations and not effective in other situations. What are some of the things that help us consider which approach to use? Some of the variables that would determine which approach is most suitable for our conflict resolution are listed on this slide. The first one is importance of the issue. How important is the issue to you? If the issue is extremely important and it's imperative to you that your approach will be followed, you might choose to use the forcing conflict resolution style. If you know that the issue is very important for organizational survival or team success, you might decide to force the issue. If, on the other hand, the issue is not very important to you, you might choose to accommodate the other party and reap the benefits of having established goodwill and reciprocity for the future. Another important consideration is the power relationship between the parties. We discussed this earlier, horizontal conflict versus vertical conflict. Clearly, if I am not in a power position in the conflict, I cannot very well use the forcing or competitive conflict resolution style. I might be more inclined to use compromise or avoidance or accommodation if I have less power. You are only able to use the forcing conflict handling style if you have power superiority. If you care about building a long-term relationship with the other party and you want to build good trust and reciprocity for future business interactions, then the collaborative approach might suit you very well, and also the accommodating approach, especially if the issue is not very important to you. Availability of time. If this is a crisis situation and a decision needs to be made right away, you cannot successfully collaborate because the collaborative approach to conflict resolution is very time consuming. Also, the complexity of the issue. If this is a very simple issue, for example, you're trying to sell your used car and the only variable that we are discussing is the cost of the car. This is a very simple issue and there's not much we can do. Either we pay the price that the seller is asking or we walk away from the deal. But if we are buying a car from a dealership, suddenly the issue is a lot more complex because the dealer can add things to the discussion which make this picture a lot more complex and allow us to collaborate. A dealer can sell me the car for the ticket price, but also throw in some free service, extended warranty, a full tank of gas, a few car washes, all the things that the dealer can add to reach a conflict resolution by making the discussion more complex and enabling us to find a solution that's beneficial to both parties. This will all make a lot more sense once we discuss negotiation and how we negotiate between parties, which can often be a process of conflict resolution.